go by persona called the Dayton Doughboy, and I work for a couple different organizations. I work for the Veterans Memorial Museum Foundation up in Germantown, Ohio, and just recently I've been hired to work for a nonprofit organization called Doughboy MIA. Doughboy MIA is a federally funded organization where we are sending teams, myself included, over to France to search for the missing remains of American servicemen who were killed in action in the First World War. We are now over 100 years after the cease of the conflict, and we are still bringing home boys that were lost. So it's a great honor and a privilege to me to be able to be a part of that. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the First World War for you, and I'm doing this in a new program. This is my first unveiling of this. I've told the story of World War I countless of times for various different libraries, school programs, but I wanted to do something a little different. So I wanted to tell the story of World War I through the eyes of actual veterans. I'm going to be telling you guys about 3 separate veterans and the stories of those gentlemen. I brought with me in the back some artifacts relating to all 3 of those individual people. Always start off with saying, why do we study World War I, or why is it relevant? You know, this conflict is over 100 years old, and yet here in the United States, there's hardly any memorials about it. I do applaud the city of Reading for having one of the first over on Jefferson, and as Alan said, on June 8th, we're going to be doing a rededication ceremony there, and I will be there in full gear and equipment with a layout of weapons and all the knickknacks that all the soldiers carried. But it's hardly remembered in the United States. A little statistics for you, though. At the time of World War I, we had 4.7 million men from this country serve in the war. Out of that 4.7 million, 2.5 million actually served overseas in France fighting. At the end of the war, there was a huge battle called the Meuse-Argonne campaign, and it was the largest and the bloodiest battle in the entirety of United States military history. For 47 continuous days of combat, we had over 1.5 million men in active combat, and it is completely forgotten about today. The reasons why it's forgotten is because there's no living veterans anymore. I do meet all kinds of people who tell me that they've had a relative who served in the war, but there's no one left alive to tell these stories. So it's bestowed onto people like me to share their legacies and keep their memories alive. The war is also overshadowed a lot by other conflicts such as World War II and Vietnam. These are still conflicts very fresh in our collective memory. And I will tell you real quick in a little comparison, World War II is literally 4 times larger in World War I. Every statistic you throw out there for World War I, we had 4.7 million men, serving in World War I. We had 16 million men serving in World War II. We had 1 year of active combat in World War I. We had 4 years of active combat in World War II. Even the casualties, we had 116,516 men killed in World War I. We had over 416,000 Americans killed in World War II. So World War II statistically is 4 times bigger. Another point I like to bring out is there's no major media about World War I. Almost all the movies, stories you hear are usually British-centric, talking about the valiant efforts of the British. But there's not much that happened here in the United States, so we don't have those grandiose movies and stories. Probably the 2 most prominent are Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, made in 1940, which tells the story of Alvin C. York, the most decorated American soldier in World War I. The next would be The Lost Battalion, which was an episode that happened in the Argonne Forest where Major Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Division led a battalion-sized force, roughly 500 men strong, into the Argonne Forest, and they were cut off and surrounded for 5 days. When they were finally relieved, less than 200 of those men came out alive. One last thing I want to point out about World War I, and this is a vital thing. No other conflict in history has been so important to the course of history as this one. We actually have all of the repercussions of World War I is what we have felt throughout the 20th and the 21st century. There would have not been a Second World War without the outcome of the first. It would not have been a Cold War because of the Russian Revolution and the rise of Bolshevism and communism. Even the issues with terrorism in the Middle East all stem from how World War I ended. But as I was saying, I'm going to tell you guys the story of 3 separate veterans, and incidentally, all 3 veterans were machine gunners in World War I. These are, of course, 3 separate machine guns, and I just happened to come a little luck with this picture because each one of those guns is the kind of machine gun each one of these veterans I'm going to be talking about actually used. The one here on the very left, that's a French Hotchkiss machine gun. The middle one is an American Browning 1917, and the far right is a British Vickers machine gun. Now, to tell you real quick a general history of World War I and how it started with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in June of 1914. He was assassinated by a terrorist organization that was backed by the country of Serbia, and Serbia was fighting for their own independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austro-Hungarian laid down some ultimatums on Serbia, which they complied with all but one. So Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The problem was they were afraid Russia, which was a huge ally of Serbia, would intervene. So Austro-Hungary asked Germany to back them up. Russia started to mobilize their troops, and Germany knew that if they got in a war with Russia, they would immediately get into a war with France and fight a 2-front war. So they took the preemptive strike, they declared war on Russia, and immediately invaded through Belgium to conquer France. Their plan was to beat France quickly in a matter of weeks, and we'll only have to worry about fighting against Russia. Of course, when Germany invaded Belgium, this brought in the British and the British Empire. And at the time, the British Empire was one of the most massive empires in the world, controlling numerous colonies and Commonwealth nations such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, various parts of Africa. So as soon as Britain entered the war, they started pulling forces from all around the world, and this truly did become a world war. One of the crazy nations to join was Japan. Japan actually jumped in and declared war against Germany and fought along the side of the Allies. The last nation to fight was the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to fight against Russia, and France and England decided we were going to fight against the Ottomans and hopefully knock them out and have more control over what is now the present-day Middle East. The first veteran I would like to talk about is Private Claude Wilford Leo Pittendry. He went by the name of Leo, and he was from Australia. He was born in 1881. He enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces and was a member of what was called the Anzacs. The Anzacs was an army corps composed of Australian and New Zealand personnel. In fact, that's an acronym, Australian New Zealand Army Corps. Incidentally, Australia is one of the only countries in the whole war, and there were 28 nations overall that fought in this conflict, that never drafted. It had an entirely volunteer army. Now, Leo, he leaves Australia to join the war, and was sent immediately to Egypt for training with the Anzacs. They had the goal of protecting the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal from Germany and basically securing the Middle East and kind of isolating the Ottoman Empire. They all had anticipations to be moving off to France to fight against Germany, but surprisingly, they stayed there in the desert and trained for desert warfare. So they realized quickly that they were actually going to be fighting against the Ottomans. In 1915, the second year of the war, a Admiralty of the British Navy, Winston Churchill, who everybody knows famously from World War II, came up with this idea: let's send the Anzacs and British and French forces over to a little area called Gallipoli. Gallipoli is right on the Turkish straits between the Mediterranean Sea linking all the way to the Black Sea. The goal was, if they captured this area, they would be able to land force up through Turkey and capture Constantinople and knock out Turkey. In addition, this would also help secure supply routes to the Russians for the Allies to send equipment to. Now, Gallipoli, this is kind of like the World War I version of the Normandy invasion. The Turks knew that they were coming. In fact, they had put sea mines out in the sea for all the ships, and they had a heck of a time just trying to get to the beaches. Once they got to the beaches, the Turks had dug trenches and dugouts high up on the hills overlooking the beaches. So they had the upper ground, the high ground, and they were able to easily shoot down on the beaches on the British, the French, and the Australian forces landing. A lot of the fighting got very fierce, and of course the temperatures in this desert environment became extremely hostile. Now, Leo was at Gallipoli, and after several months at Gallipoli fighting their way inland, trying to get a foothold on these beaches, they decided to launch a massive battle at an area they call Lone Pine. The object of Lone Pine was actually a diversionary battle that they decided to send the Australians at to tie up the Ottomans so that the British can launch a series of attacks further down the beaches and hopefully get a flanking position. The Australians actually captured the main line of the Ottoman Turkish defenses within the first hour of the fight. But the Turks launched a series of counterattacks that lasted for 3 days. When it was all said and done, the Australian forces lost over 2,300 men in this one battle. And to many of the Australian soldiers, such as Leo, they decided to set the Battle of Lone Pine as the standard. This is the toughest it's going to get. And every subsequent battle that they fought afterwards, they would always hold it in comparison to how bad Lone Pine was. After the Battle of Lone Pine failed and all these other battles that it was supposed to support failed, and they could not get off the beaches, the British and the French decided to give up, and they started to evacuate. The entire Gallipoli campaign lasted from April of 1915 all the way through December. And the British and the Australians designed several tactical moves which were very ingenious, and one of them was what they call the dripping rifle. This picture right up here, my laser pointer is not pointing, but this rifle here has a series of cans that they would fill with water and poke a hole in it so that it would drip into the can below it. After the can got so heavy, it would pull a tripwire, which would then pull the trigger of the rifle, making the gun shoot. They would set these guns in various positions, so then they would evacuate, and then the guns would go off randomly, convincing that the Turks that there was still a force occupying their trenches and not realize that they had evacuated and ran away. After Leo and the Australians left Gallipoli, they moved on to England to be refitted and retrained. At the same time, in 1916, the battles on the Western Front in France became the most pivotal and most dire part of the war. This is where everybody thinks of World War I, the trench warfare, the machine guns, the artillery barrages, and just massive, massive amounts of death and destruction. There were two major battles that happened on the Western Front in 1916. The first was the Battle of Verdun. Basically with Verdun is a little fortress city on the northeastern end of France, and it had no significance of military importance. It hadn't had any strategic place. It was just a city of French pride. And the Germans wagered that if they attacked Verdun in force, the French would defend it to their very last. So they would come out, and because of how the war was progressing with trench warfare, they realized that this war was going to have to be fought as a war of attrition. Wear out the enemy before the enemy wears you out. Verdun lasted, and it is one of the longest battles in history. It lasted from February of 1916 all the way out to December of 1916. For almost every French soldier that the Germans had killed at the Battle of Verdun, the French inflicted the same kind of casualty on the Germans. At the end of this one battle, over 1 million soldiers on both sides were killed in one battle. To help alleviate the fighting at Verdun, the British decided to launch their own massive attack on the Somme River Valley. This is the famous Battle of the Somme. It is also very pivotal in importance like Verdun. It started out with a 3-day bombardment of artillery firing on the German lines. In that 3 days, they fired over 1 million rounds of artillery shells. They told all the British soldiers that they were going to just obliterate the German trenches, and when it was time to go over the top and attack, there'd be nothing left, so the soldiers would be able to come out of the trenches and just walk across no man's land at a gentle pace. On July 1st, the whistles blew and the British soldiers went over the top, walking as they were instructed, only to find out that those 1 million rounds of artillery, the majority of them were duds. The Germans had dug deep underground bunkers to withstand and sustain themselves from the artillery bombardment. And when the artillery stopped, the Germans knew that here they come. So they quickly got in their positions and manned machine guns. Within the first hour of the battle, 60,000 British were shot. 20,000 of them were killed. This is considered, to this day, the biggest loss in British military history. While all this was going on, Leo was staying in the back, training, being refit. This battle lasted again from July all the way through November of 1916. And as the British would advance a little further each day, and I'm talking only a few yards each day, they got into positions and places where the front lines developed bulges. There was one such bulge around a farm called Bouquet Farm. The British had protruded into it, so the Germans were in front of them and to the sides of them. And this created what is called a salient, where the Germans could fire onto the British from 3 different directions. And they pretty much massacred the British. So the British pulled their soldiers out and said, let's send in the Australians. Leo fought throughout this battle for the rest of 1916 and survived. At the same time that all this horrible bloodshed was going on the Western Front in 1916, here in the United States, life was totally different. This is my second veteran, Sergeant Lawrence Edwards Reynolds. Lawrence, as he was simply called, was a young Kentucky boy. He had a hard life from the get-go. His mother died when he was about 8 years old, and then his father was killed in a truck accident when he was about 16. His neighbors had arranged plans with his father that if something would happen to him, that they would take over the family farm and the family businesses and provide for the kids. But the neighbors didn't have those intentions exactly. Instead, the neighbors assumed control of the family business and the family farm and started making Lawrence and his siblings indentured servants, basically. They said that if you wanted to stay here and live here, you had to work and provide our people, our family, with the means to. Lawrence didn't like this, so at the age of 16, in about 1910, he ran away. He lied about his age and said he was over 18 and enlisted in the U.S. Army. Now, at the time, the United States was having a little bit of a conflict, minor. It wasn't anything serious, with a bunch of banditos along the U.S.-Mexican border. In particular, there was this fellow named Pancho Villa, who is here in the upper left. He was leading raids into what is now the United States state of New Mexico, in a little town on the border called Columbus, and it was causing havoc. So the Wilson administration decided to send the U.S. Army on the U.S.-Mexican border to protect our interests. After so much of this little standoff, little fights here and there, they got sick and tired of it and said, you know what, we're sending the army into Mexico and we're going to capture this bandito. The gentleman chosen to lead the army was General John Blackjack Pershing. Pershing will end up becoming the leader of the U.S. Army throughout World War I. And interesting enough, he is also the highest ranking general in the U.S. Army. He was awarded at the end of World War I the unique rank of called General of the Armies, plural, which would have been equivalent to a 6-star general. All the high 5-star generals you hear about in World War II, such as Eisenhower, Bradley, MacArthur, they actually would have been subordinates to Pershing. There's only one other person in U.S. history that this rank was awarded to, and that was in the 1970s. Congress retroactivated this rank and bestowed it on General George Washington, leader of the Continental Army. Couple pictures here. This is actually Lawrence in uniform by the chair, and those are pictures on the right of Lawrence down in the Mexican border chasing Pancho. Little famous fun story about him. He developed a sense of entrepreneurship while he was down there, and for 10 cents a day he agreed to wash off his fellow soldiers' uniforms, clothes, started his own laundromat, and he made a little side business and he would send the money back home to his siblings. Now, while all this is going on, because of how the things were going with Mexico, the Germans knew that the U.S. and Mexico's relation was not the greatest. So they sent a note to the Mexican government saying, hey, if you join the war, this big, great war, and join on the side of Germany, we'll help you, Mexico, fight the United States. And when we win the war, you'll get all this lost land that the United States stole from you. The areas of the southwest United States, which are the states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. Well, the British intercepted this note, called the Zimmerman Note, and actually sent it to the Wilson administration. It said, hey, you might want to look at what's going on here. So needless to say, when public opinion heard of the Zimmerman Note, we were not too happy with Germany. In addition to that, Germany was declaring all ships on the high seas as threats to the German state. The United States was considered a neutral nation, and it is true, and I hate to say, we were war profiteering. We were making equipment, weapons, material, and selling it to any side that had the money. The British and the French actually set up a very effective blockade so no ships could get to Germany. and it was slowly strangling and starving Germany. So to get around the blockade, the Germans started using a new weapon, the U-boat. It's a submarine. And they decided, well, you know, if we can't get stuff to Germany, France and Britain shouldn't be able to get anything. And they threatened to shoot unprovoked, without warning, torpedoes at any ship going to France or England. In 1915, in May, there was a famous passenger ship, much like the Titanic, called the Lusitania, that was sunk. It was sailing from New York City to Ireland, and just off the coast of Ireland, a U-boat shot 2 torpedoes into the hull, and it sank, taking over 12,000 people with it, 128 American citizens, men, women, children, babies, everything. Now, this brought us to the brink of war with Germany there. And Germany started to say, we won't sink unprovoked. We'll have our submarines come out and give you warning, let the crews get to lifeboats, and then we'll sink your ship. This lasted for a very short while until the British started arming merchant ships. So when the submarine would come up above the water, these Q-boats is what they called them, would have guns pop out everywhere and shoot this U-boat. So the Germans are like, okay, if you're not going to play fair, we're going to go back to just sinking ships. So in 1917, in February, they started sinking again American merchant ships without warning. And we finally drew a line in the sand, and after 2 ships, the Arabic and the Sussex, were sunk, we finally said enough is enough. Wilson asked Congress for a formal declaration of war against Imperial Germany. And on April 6, Congress voted to declare war. Now, our problem is when we got into this conflict, the United States was dreadfully unprepared for this war. Our entire military force, this is Army, this is Navy, this is Marine Corps, this is National Guard. Our entire force was about 200,000 men. The year before, in 1916, at the Battle of Verdun, the French lost 1 million men in one battle alone. This is not going to sustain. We needed help, and we needed to grow our forces quick. Congress passed some new laws. Some of these laws are still effective today, such as the Selective Service Act, which requires every American male citizen of the age of 18 to register for the draft. We, of course, have not had a draft implemented in this country since the Vietnam War. But within months, we grew our military force from 200,000 to over 4.7 million men. The first soldiers to sail over was dubbed the 1st Division. Lawrence was assigned to H Company of the 18th Infantry. He was a corporal at the time, and he was assigned to this 1st Division. On June 17th, the first convoy of American soldiers left. They were broken into 4 separate groups. Lawrence was in the 3rd group. He sailed out of New York Harbor on June 17th with 3 other ships, 1 cruiser as an escort, and 4 destroyers, and then 1 support ship. Incidentally, his group, the support ship, was the USS Cyclops, which was a famous ship that was later lost towards the end of the war in the famed Bermuda Triangle. Nobody knows what happened to the ship. It's a mystery, still unsolved to this day. But anyways, the ships, all these 4 groups convened out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and started to sail across. About the 3rd day of their voyage, a German U-boat spotted them. And they were told, the Germans were told by their leader, the Kaiser, not to let 1 single American set foot on Europe. So the U-boats started shooting torpedoes at the convoy. Luckily, lookouts spotted them, and they took evasive action, and they missed. The destroyers did their work and chased after the submarines, dropping depth charges. It's not known whether or not they hit the submarine or not, but no more traces of the submarine were ever found. They started to get radio reports shortly after that there was heavy submarine activity outside the port city of Brest, France, which was the port of destination for the convoy. So under strict radio silence, they changed their heading and they sailed to Saint Nazaire, France instead, and they made port on June 26, 1917 at Saint Nazaire. This ship here is the USS Henry R. Mallory, which was the actual ship that Lawrence sailed on. And over there is a passenger manifest, and you can find his name on it. Now, once they arrived in France, and there was a lot of pomp and circumstance that went on, the French were happy the Americans were there. Pershing actually toured Paris, met all the politicians and everything, and he asked to go to see the grave site of Marquis Lafayette. Marquis Lafayette was a famous French general who helped General Washington win the United States independence at the Battle of Yorktown. It is said that one of Pershing's aides famously said once they got to the gravesite of Lafayette, "Lafayette, we are here to pay back our debt to France," indicating that the United States was going to help France in their hour of need, just as the French helped the American people in our hour of need. Now, training all throughout the winter months of 1917, 1918, the division was reformed and Lawrence was promoted to sergeant on January 12, 1918, and was signed to C Company of the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion, 1st Division. He was armed with a French Hotchkiss machine gun, just like the one I showed you in that first picture. They continued training with the French, learning how to fight this war. One of the more famous stories in the training is the French decided to teach Americans how to throw hand grenades. And they didn't think we would be able to do it because the French don't play sports. But incidentally, we were able to adapt to throwing hand grenades like a fish in water. The reason why is because American boys are used to playing baseball. On November 3rd, November 4th, it was the night of November 3rd and 4th, the American troops went into the trenches for the first time for combat. The Germans knew it, and they launched a series of raids right about midnight. In that attack, the Germans planned to cut off all the lines with artillery and send their troops in with the goal of capturing American prisoners. That way they could do a huge propaganda and brag that, you know, the American people, the American soldier is not an effective, weak person. We showed the Germans. But at the end of all the fighting there, 3 gentlemen lay dead. This is Private Thomas Enright, Corporal James Grisham, and Private Merle Hay. They were the first 3 Americans to be killed in the war. Now, as the war was going on, in October of 1917, Russia started to have the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks took power and overthrew the Tsar government, and communism set in. The Russians, the new communist government, signed a peace treaty with the Germans at a little town called Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. This effectively ended the war between Germany and Russia, with Germany winning the war. This ended that second front. The Germans no longer had to fight the Russians. So they sent millions of battle-hardened soldiers that were fighting the Russians to the Western Front in an all-out gamble to beat the Allies before the Americans could arrive. On March 20th, they launched the first of their major attacks. They call it the Kaiserschlag. This is the Kaiser's battle. And again, this was the Kaiser's race against time, hoping to beat the French and the British before Americans could arrive. Our first buddy, Leo, was caught up in the tail of these battles at a little town called Arras and was fighting to hold the line and keep the Germans from pushing on. The Germans actually, within the first 2 months, were able to drive the Allies, who were unprepared for this fight, 40 miles along the river bank, the banks of the river Marne, 40 miles from Paris. This is the closest the Germans got to winning the war. But surprisingly, Americans started showing up in numbers. On May 8th, the 1st Division started to move forward, and they were setting up positions outside a little village called Cantigny. This was the first major battle for the Americans. Lawrence was in this position, and the Germans started to launch an artillery bombardment on their positions, and Lawrence's platoon, 12 men, got hit. Almost every one of them were killed or wounded. Lawrence himself, in his trenches, an artillery shell landed near him, blew him out of the trench. A second one landed and threw him right back in. He ended up being severely hurt and injured. There was another gentleman who was crying out for help, so Lawrence crawled to try to render aid, but the gentleman didn't make it. Lawrence was left alone by himself. All 11 of his men were killed. He was afraid that the Germans were going to attack any moment. Still wounded, he started crawling back and forth along the trenches and manned 4 separate machine guns. He would get to one gun and shoot it for a few moments, crawl on to the second, shoot it, crawl on to the third, shoot it, crawl on to the fourth. He continued this action for 8 hours straight. When he got thirsty, he would drink whatever canteens he could find, even off the dead. At one point, the Germans tried to rush him, but he was able to fend them off with the machine guns. When relief finally came and they found Lawrence was the only one left, they evacuated him. He was awarded what was called at the time a wound chevron. In 1932, wound chevrons were upgraded to the now known Purple Heart Medal. In addition, he was also awarded what is called a Silver Citation Star. In 1936, Silver Citation Stars were awarded or upgraded to what we now know as the Silver Star Medal. The Battle of Cantigny, however, happened about 20 days later, roughly a little over 2 weeks after Lawrence being wounded and evacuated. His old regiment, the 18th and the 28th, led the attack against the village. The main point of this was to prove to the Allies, mainly the French and the British, that Americans would fight. This was our first battle, and within the first 30 minutes, we cleared the village. Fighting would continue on severely for the next several months. But because of the fighting at Cantigny, there were a couple more famous American battles, such as the Battle of Chateau Thierry along the banks of the Marne River, where the 3rd Division earned their nickname Rock of the Marne. A few days later, after Chateau Thierry, there was another very famous battle at a place called Belleau Wood. This is where the United States Marine Corps entered into the conflict and earned their legacy. The story goes that as the Marines were coming up, the French were evacuating and retreating. A French officer came up to a captain of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. His name was Lloyd Williams. And the French officer told him, "Retreat, retreat, the Germans are coming." He famously replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Instead, he rallied up the Marines. They started fixing bayonets and charged across open wheat fields into the woods that the Germans had occupied with heavy machine guns. The Germans were shelling them with artillery. They were throwing everything, including mustard gas, to try to stop the Marines. But the Marines fought to the point where they were at hand-to-hand combat. It is said, legend said, that the Germans didn't know what to make of the Marines. They called them wild beasts. They said that they fought like Teufelhunden, which is German for deviled dogs. It is a nickname that sticks to the Marine Corps to this day. At the time of all this was going on, our 3rd veteran, Private Andrew Perry Craig, He was born in Jamestown. He was drafted. He actually got kind of upset that there was only 3 other people from his hometown that didn't go. He entered service in Wilmington, was transferred from Wilmington, Ohio, down to Camp Zachary Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. He wanted to be in the artillery because he felt that they were going to be away from the fighting enough, shooting the big guns, that he would be relatively safe. But he was actually a rather small, stout guy. So they put him instead in the infantry, where he would be up front. Then they realized that he had some education, and as a trade, he was a machinist. So they made him a machine gunner in a machine gun company in the infantry. After a few weeks of training at Camp Taylor, he was sent to Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, where he continued his training on the machine gun. Now, these pictures are from a private collection of another gentleman who was in his unit, but this is actually at Camp Lee in Virginia. These are pretty much the same kind of conditions that Andrew served in. There's a letter that he had written home, which was actually kind of funny. He talked about the heat and how hot it was down in Louisiana. His mom had sent him some ham sandwiches in the mail. So when he got them, he wrote home to thank his mom, but then asked politely, please don't send any more because they spoiled. While all the training was going on, back at the war, the Australians, our buddy Leo, decided, they wanted to get the Americans involved in the fight a little bit more than just Cantigny and Chateau Thierry. The British gave control of the Australian army to their own general, a guy named Monash, and he decided to launch an attack in that old Somme battleground on a village called Hamel. This attack was going to be the first time Americans and Australian forces would fight side by side. The 33rd Illinois National Guard was chosen, but General Pershing actually said that they were not ready for fighting. They didn't have enough training. So a lot of those soldiers decided, we're not going to listen to you, we're going to go ahead and join this fight anyways, even if it means taking off our uniforms and putting on Australian uniforms, and we're not Americans anymore, we're going to be Aussies. The battle lasted 90 minutes, and it was the first battle in history to use combined armed tactics, where they had tanks supporting the machine guns and the artillery, supporting the infantry, and aircraft coming over, and it all worked like a giant orchestra all at once. Incidentally, the Battle of Hamel was chosen to be launched on July 4th to help boost the morale of the Americans. 5 days later, the Germans launched a counterattack, and Leo was set up in a machine gun position outside Hamel to defend off the Germans. Artillery shells started raining in. One exploded, and a piece of shrapnel hit him in the upper thigh. He was wounded severely, and they evacuated Leo. While all this was going on, and I was talking about Andrew, the American forces were building up. By May of 1918, Americans were arriving at France at a rate of 10,000 men a day. This is the USS Huron, which was the ship Andrew sailed on into France, and he actually went over in August of 1918. And of course, there's the ship Manifest. Going back to our second veteran, Lawrence, the 1st Division was launched in the Battle of St. Mihiel. St. Mihiel was the first battle of the U.S. Army as an independent army. All the battles before, Cantigny, Chateau Thierry, Belleau Wood, Hamel, the U.S. Army was fighting under commands of British or French generals. This was the first time Americans decided to pick the battleground where they wanted to fight at. It was a little salient around the village of St. Mihiel, and We launched our attack and cleared out the salient in 3 days. In the middle of that salient was the 1st Division with Lawrence. Right after St. Mihiel, Field Marshal Foch, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, he was a French Field Marshal. He was the World War I equivalent of Eisenhower, decided that the Germans were on the verge of losing this war, and we were going to push on them from every angle. The British launched in the attack up in the north around the city of Ypres and Flanders and the Somme. The French fought in the center. The Americans would fight in the southern area. The area around that old city that I talked about, that big battle, Verdun, there's a little river that runs right through the city of Verdun called the Meuse River. And to the west of it is an ancient medieval forest called the Argonne Forest. Roughly between the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River is about 18 kilometers. And this area was the most heavily guarded and defended section of the line. The Germans had occupied this area for the entire 4 years of the war. The Americans decided we were going to go through it. On September 26th, we launched an artillery barrage that lasted 3 hours. They call it the $1 Million Barrage because it was estimated for every 1 minute that artillery fired, it was costing U.S. taxpayers $1 million. This is in 1918 money. After the artillery ceased, the American troops went up over the top and started crossing wide open spaces. The Germans had set up a series of defensive trenches called the Hindenburg Line, and they had interlocking positions of machine gun fire, and they annihilated our troops. We pressed on the attack for 46 days. The Big Red One, the 1st Division, they were actually pulled out of St. Mihiel. One of the divisions fighting in the Meuse-Argonne was a division called the 80th Division. The 80th was the only division in the U.S. Army that had fought all 3 phases of the Meuse-Argonne. They were getting pulled out of the line and was being relieved by the 1st Division. So as the 80th was backing away, Lawrence in the 1st was moving forward to the front lines. As the 80th came out, they went to an area in the Argonne Forest that was already captured for the Americans, a little village called Lina 4. And Andrew joined the 80th Division there. While he was there, he was equipped with brand new machine guns, a new wonder weapon that the Americans had. It was designed by a gun maker named John Browning. And John Browning's own son, Vale Browning, was over there with the 80th Division when they got the guns. This picture here, the man behind the gun, is Lieutenant Vale Browning. The men behind are the 80th Division guys of the 314th Machine Gun Battalion, which is the unit Andrew was assigned to. The picture over on the right is Andrew's unit fighting in the Argonne Forest with the new guns. After they were equipped with the new guns for about a week and learned how they worked and got proficient with them, they were sent back up to the front lines for the big final push. They set up their positions to breach the Hindenburg Line, the most defended area of the German trenches, between a little town called Grand Prix and Saint-Juvon. Andrew wrote that he remembers the Germans did everything they could to stop the attack. In fact, they fired so much mustard gas, it is estimated 1 out of every 3 German artillery shells fired was a mustard gas shell. Andrew talked about mustard gas, saying that despite the name gas, it's more of a vapor. They would fire it at early morning hours, like around 1 or 2. The alarms would go off, the soldiers would put their masks on, and the vapors would settle into the ground. After a little while, the all clear would be given, the soldiers would take their mask off. When the sun would come up, the gas would be evaporated and come back out without warning and affect them. So they would have to live in their gas masks for days on end. After they finally breached the Hindenburg Line, there was no defenses that the Germans had left between the Western Front and Berlin. So the Germans were in complete run, and they asked for an armistice, an end to the fighting. A German delegation met the Allies in a little train car near the city or little town of Copenhagen, France. And at about 5:30 in the morning, they signed an agreement for a ceasefire. They agreed that the effects of the ceasefire would take place at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. This gave hours for all those men and soldiers to be alerted, to be told the war ends at 11 o'clock. But we continued fighting all the way up to the very last second. 11 o'clock hit, the gun stopped, and it was silence. You could hear the birds chirping, nothing. And then all of a sudden, this excited jubilation of celebration happened. The war was over. At the time of the armistice, Lawrence and Andrew both were in the frontline trenches. Now, Andrew was able to come home first. He ended up coming home in about May of 1919. He sailed home aboard the USS New Jersey, a battleship, which is over here on the right. Lawrence stayed over in France and then into Germany for occupation duty, and then he was actually sent home in June of 1919. He sailed into New York Harbor, and the 1st Division had one of the biggest celebratory victory parades in New York City. As far as Leo goes, when he was wounded outside of Hamel on July 9th, he was evacuated to a hospital, and during his evacuation, they could not stop the bleeding in his leg. He sadly bled out, and he died on July 9th, 1918. Leo is still currently buried in France at the Somme Cemetery. I wanted to bring out real quick to you folks, my friend Joe Otmar here. Joe, raise your hand, please. Joe is the great nephew of Leo Pittendry. Lawrence Reynolds remained in the service for a while, retired, went to work at Armco Steel in Middletown. He met a young lady there named Ella, and they married, had several kids. His son, Larry, actually enlisted in the U.S. Army in the 71st Infantry Division and fought in World War II as a combat medic. Larry's unit was credited with liberating Gunskirchenlager concentration camp in Austria in World War II. There's a wonderful picture here of Lawrence and Larry together.
Is it that bottom middle?
Bottom middle. He remained active in the American Legion and the VFW post. Pam Adams here, Pam, raise your hand, is the granddaughter of Lawrence. Andrew Craig, he also went home to Wilmington, married a young lady named Cora, and they settled in Middletown also. They had one daughter, Reba, and adopted their niece, Margaret. Reba is my grandmother. Andrew is my great-grandfather. This is a picture of my great-grandparents' wedding, and these are pictures of my great-grandfather's grave with me at his tombstone, and his unit history, his unit battalion picture there. This past October 1918, I got to go over to France and trace his footsteps 100 years to the month of where he was. And with guides and help from the American Battlefield Monument Commission, I got the battle maps and I found the area roughly, and I'm talking within a 100-yard radius of where he was at when he entered the lines. Out of this giant farm field in full bloom in October, I found a solemn bush of poppy bushes. The flower up there at the top is an actual close-up of that poppy. The poppy is a flower of remembrance to remember those who died in World War I. Legend has it that back in the ancient days, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, when he invaded Europe, he brought from the Middle East poppy flowers, and they grew beautifully white flowers. After the battles of the Somme and the Ypres and Verdun, they said that the ground was soaked with so much blood that when the flowers started coming back, they grew red. And they continue to grow red to this day. Talking to the locals, they told me that that area in the Meuse are gone. Poppies can be found, but they're not common. They're kind of a rare. And to find one in full bloom in October is a very, very rare treat. To me, and I'm a little bit of a spiritual person, I believe finding that flower was a divine message saying, my grandpa was right there. Now, I'm going to end with talking a little bit about this organization, Doughboy MIA, that I was telling you about at the beginning. The guide I was working with when I was in France was Robert Laplander. He is the foremost expert and author on the subject about the Lost Battalion. He runs this organization, and the U.S. military does not touch World War I because they consider it too far gone. Anything predating World War II, the U.S. military will not send out for their MIA projects. But there are still men listed from World War I as missing in action. It is the goal that the Doughboy MIA has to find and locate the remains of American servicemen who fought in the First World War and find closure and even bring these guys home. These have been through carefully going through the archives and the records, and it may be something as simplistic as missing from an honor roll. But then there have been cases, and we have a few, where they have found remains and have positively identified the remains of soldiers and have brought them home. Rob asked me earlier this year to join him as his assistant field director, and my job is I'm going to be going back to France on recon missions to help survey areas where we suspect that there might be remains still at. The slogan is, a man is only forgotten. A man is only missing if he is forgotten. So it is our goal with World War I and Doughboy MIA to still remember the stories and the legacies of those who fought in the Great War, such as Leo Pittendry, Lawrence Reynolds, and my own great-grandfather, Andrew Craig. Thank you.